Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and today I want to tell you about the 10 worst mechanics of all time. Now, to set the stage, this doesn't mean most powerful mechanics. For example, Storm is incredibly broken, but there is fun design space there, and in more restrictive formats like Limited, it's cool to try and set up your fair Storm deck. Similarly, a weak or boring mechanic isn't necessarily a bad design. Afflict isn't winning any awards, but it's totally fine and functional. No. Today, we're going to look at mechanics which are the worst design. They might be unfun, make undesirable things happen in the game, or similar problems. And real quickly too, before we get started, a disclaimer that this is all my opinion. Different Magic designers may feel differently. And a lot of hard work went into all these mechanics, so I'm not knocking the effort behind them at all. They all had good intentions, even if they didn't come out that way. Hey, I did a video talking about designs I regret making. It happens. With that said, let's kick it off. First, I want to give an honorable mention. Imagine you're cracking a pack of Battle for Zendikar. You're so excited, the Eldrazi are back, and you find your first one. You look and read the first line of text, devoid. This card is colorless. Weird, but you're sure there's a reason, right? You skim the rest of the text. Nothing. No reason for it being colorless. Both baffling and underwhelming. Devoid to me, in execution, was something we had to write on a ton of cards in Battle for Zendikar block. Ended up mattering very little, and made the Eldrazi seem less cool rather than more cool. Now I'll admit, some of that is partially on execution. Maybe if every Devoid card cared about colorless, it would be a better fit. Ultimately, this is hardly really even a mechanic though. It's really just a way of writing out a colorless color indicator, like how we do to show color on cards like packs. It's a mechanic which most of the time means literally nothing. But really, it's a tool more than a mechanic, so it gets an honorable mention from me. Now, let's get onto the list. Coming in at number 10, Ice Age Block Standby, Cumulative Upkeep. What's more fun than paying loans? Cumulative Upkeep asks you to pay a cost into your creature that grows higher every single turn. This means that every turn you have the fun and exciting decision of, do I want to keep my permanent in play, or do I want to have mana to cast my other spells? Not the most enjoyable thing. To make matters worse, it's a mechanic which often punishes the less experienced player who has trouble grasping the tempo trade-off. For example, let's say you play a Balduvian Fallen. It seems innocent enough, paying 1 mana to keep it alive each turn. But what actually happens here is that every turn, you just stone rain one of your own lands. And while you spend all this time investing in a medium creature, your opponent can use their mana much more effectively every turn. Oh, and that's not even to say anything of the problem where if you accidentally draw your card and miss your upkeep trigger at some levels of tournament play, that means you didn't pay and your creature is just sacrificed. A pretty big oops. I think the best cumulative upkeep cards are actually some of the ones without mana payments. For example, Jotun Grunt or Wall of Shards, which ask more interesting questions. But on the whole, this mechanic is pretty rough. I could see us doing a new card as a one-of in a Modern Horizons or Commander set, but I wouldn't expect to see many cumulative upkeep cards anytime soon. Number 9 is a mechanic Melissa and I covered in our Commander Chronicles review of the original Commander decks. Join forces. You can go watch that for a more in-depth breakdown, but the gist is this. There are very few designs that can use this mechanic. So few that there were basically 4 alright spells to make, and then the team needed to make a creature to finish the cycle. These cards disproportionately benefit other players more than you and give them control over your spell. The heart of this is definitely in the right place, and as we've seen more iteration in Commander design, I think Join Forces was a good launchpad to things like Demonstrate and Tempting Offer. But on its own, there really isn't a lot here to make compelling cards. And so, it slots onto this list. A theme you're going to see a lot on this list is cards that cause you to do the same thing every turn. And a prime example of this to me is Buyback, coming in at number 8. Don't get me wrong, I know Buyback has a fuzzy nostalgic place in a lot of people's hearts, but Buyback is very hard to make fun. When it's working, it just becomes, I do this every turn at the expense of all other game actions. It's not only repetitive, but it makes other cards the player draws just less relevant. From Capsize to Sprout Swarm to Forbid, to Constant Miss, Buyback has caused plenty of unfun situations. And to make matters tougher to deal with, Buyback exists in your opponent's hand, so it's very hard to interact with. Short of discard spells, counter spells, or getting rid of the target in the response to fizzle the spell, it's just going to keep happening. That's not to say there aren't some enjoyable designs. Whispers of the Muse I think is a nice way of threading that needle, but as a mechanic, it's very hard to find fun space here. Compare Buyback with Flashback, which lets you do it once, or Retrace, which, while being still toward the bottom slice of Magic mechanics, at least keeps the mystery of, will they draw a land to do it again? With Buyback, there is no mystery or tension. Just the Weatherlight showing up in your end step, sending your permanents back to your hand again and again. And if you thought Buyback was awesome, well, then you're going to love Buyback with even fewer interaction points. Coming in hot on the heels of Buyback at number 7 is Forecast. It's the Azorius mechanic from original Ravnica block. You might not know this one, and it's because fortunately, the frustrating nature of it was known in design, so it was priced in a way where it wouldn't be great. That's never a good sign. In your upkeep, you can pay a cost and reveal it to do an effect. At a design level, the only way to interact with this is pretty much discard. You can't counter it, and removing the target doesn't get rid of the card. It does have the saving grace of only happening in your upkeep, but that's not much of one. Now, this is a great example of a mechanic which is weak historically because the cards with it were weak, but the times where it has shown up in competitive play, like Proclamation of Rebirth, it's led to pretty frustrating decks, where you return Martyr of Sands every turn. If there were more ubiquitous Foretell cards, you'd probably have heard a lot about people hating this mechanic. Hey, you know what a fun part of Magic is? Casting spells. So let's just stop doing that entirely. That was the case with this one, the Rebels mechanic from Masks block. While not technically a named mechanic, Masks had no named mechanics, I think would make this an ability word today, and look, it's my list, I make the rules. There's even another unnamed Masks block mechanic we'll get to in a little bit. Anyway, the problem with Rebels is this. You play a Rebel, its ability lets you find a Rebel that costs 1 more. That Rebel's ability lets you find a Rebel that costs 1 more, and so on and so forth, all the way up the chain. Although realistically, you just get Lin Civi and then you can get anything. But I digress. Here's what this means. You never want to bother casting any other spells because you get free card advantage by tutoring up more Rebels. And to make matters worse, every game plays out the same because you do the same exact thing every time. Play one Rebel, which finds another, which finds another. It's at the horrifying intersection of repetitive and samey. I think it's so interesting to contrast Rebels with Mercenaries. Now, Mercenaries were laughably weaker. They tutored down the Mercenary chain. Gee, I wonder which was going to be stronger, getting cards that were higher in mana cost or getting cards that were lower in mana cost. But despite being weaker, I think Mercenaries are at least a little bit more fun. They don't self-solve by just getting you better and better cards. Anyway, let's move up to number 5, and the set Saviors of Kamigawa. This set was not only underpowered, but featured a theme of cards in hand matters, which led to things like the 7 or more cards in hand mattering creatures like Aki Underling, which would probably be on this list if I counted it as a mechanic. But it also led to the mechanic featured here, Sweep. Appearing on a whopping 4 Magic cards, this mechanic asks you to return a bunch of lands to your hand for an effect. It lets you put yourself into a tempo black hole and then scales based on that. So either you need to win the game on the spot, like Charge Across the Araba, only need to return a small number of lands, like Barrel Down Sokenzin, or something like Sink into Takanuma, which causes both you and your opponent to enter an unplayable board state. Nothing like bouncing all your lands so you can't cast your spells, while removing anything your opponent could have cast to progress the game. Mana and tempo screw yourself for an advantage isn't fun gameplay, and there's very little room for enjoyable designs here. I would be surprised if we saw Sweep again. Okay, number 4 is probably going to be pretty controversial. And if you don't believe this should be on this list, then fine. I gave you Devoid at the beginning, so I still talked about 10 total mechanics. Don't say a word. No, really, don't. Because or else, gotcha! This unhinged mechanic is brutal. It gives you your card back from the graveyard if your opponent does a specific thing, usually saying a word. That's a huge benefit to give your opponent and a massive feel bad for the violator. The biggest problem is that unsets are meant to be relaxed, fun, goofy environments. Gotcha turns that into a situation where the correct play is just to not talk. Seriously, if you want to win your match, you just shouldn't talk. That transcends so many levels of bad when it comes to what Magic is. Imagine how backbreaking it is just to say the word destroy and then slouch as your opponent returns their removal spell, Kill Destroy, back to their hand for free. Totally backbreaking. Back to the realm of black borders. Here's that other masks block mechanic I hinted about earlier. Hello, Ristic. You know what's cool? When your cards work. Ristic cards, a lot of the time, just don't. I think one of the worst cards of all time is probably Ristic Cave, a land that stone rains you if an opponent just leaves up 1 mana. Yay, now we've stone rained each other. But for a more typical example, take Ristic Siphon, a card which might do something for 5 mana, but often will cause your opponent to just tap 3 lands. To make matters worse, the gameplay incentives of Ristic being in the format are rough. You're encouraged to not cast your spells, so you can leave mana up to counter your opponent's Ristic ability. Good times. I know that Ristic Study is an incredibly popular card. I respect that it's strong. However, even that one is pretty miserable. The constant asking of, do you pay the 1 on every single spell is something I would enjoy hearing less of. At least if it was in white, I would be happy the white player was drawing cards. But alas, it's in blue. Also, Ristic Study isn't even a true Ristic card based on how the other cards worked. I don't expect to see much, if any, Ristic in the future. And yes, I know for you purists out there, it's not a named mechanic. But don't worry, from here on out, we're named mechanics only. You've heard me talk a lot so far about letting people cast their spells. Mechanics like Rebel and Buyback, which decree, here's what's probably going to happen every turn for the rest of the game. Well, at least those mechanics were nice enough to provide the hope of probably, because coming in at number 2 is another Saviors of Kamigawa All-Star, Epic. For the rest of the game, you're just going to do the same thing every turn. Hopefully, that's enough to win the game. Epic essentially turns you into an AI. What you draw is meaningless. Even Enduring Ideal, the one which saw competitive play, caused a deck which was fairly uninteresting. A 1-card combo, where if you resolved it, either your opponent had the answer for your enchantments and could kill you while you were helplessly locked under Epic, or they didn't and you won. Even the designs are rough. 2 of them cause you to search your opponent's library and select cards every turn, a time-intensive process. And finally, number 1, top of my list for worst mechanics, drumroll please. Coming in all the way from the icy wastes of Cold Snap, it's Ripple. Ah, Ripple. Pretty much nothing good has come from you. The problem is that the mechanic doesn't work, except for when it does. And then it's infuriating. In Constructed, Ripple is extremely ineffectual. 4 is not a meaningful enough number that you're going to be able to find another copy of a card with any kind of consistency. And as such, the effects are weak enough that they don't get played. Well, except for the people who want to go off with Thrumming Stone and Relentless Rats. Which brings me to the other side of things. In Limited, where you could say Ripple is designed for, it's totally miserable. Either the cards do nothing, or completely devastate your opponent in laughable ways. I remember playing a side draft at a Grand Prix once. My opponent played a land, I played a land. My opponent played a land, cast Surging Dementia, and rippled into 6 Surging Dementias. I discarded my entire hand on turn 2, in Limited. And hey, I can't complain too much. I won my fair share of Cold Snap Limited games off of rippling. I've done 6 Surging Sentinels on turn 3, or upheavaling my opponent on turn 4 with Surging Aether, but no matter who is pulling it off, it's not fun either way. The game is totally over a lot of the time after a successful ripple. If it put the copy into your hand, that could have been a great fix. But instead, it's just laughably ridiculous. A delta between doing nothing or single-handedly ruining a game of Magic. That's my pick for worst design mechanic of all time. But I'm sure you have thoughts. Do you disagree with my rankings? What would you have on here? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll talk with you again soon. And in the meantime, may you get to cast your spells. You got this.
So I spent basically all day during the day with my mom today, and we ate way too much Turkish food. Our idea was to try out everything we possibly could, and we did, so that's great for Thanksgiving. I'm glad you got to see her, by the way. She's a bit of an elusive creature. She's like a vampire or something. She doesn't really show up in many photographs, so really glad you got to hang out with my mom a brief bit there. But now